So the first thing I want to do is make the fragment class, and we're going to make it from scratch now. We're not going to use this anymore. It just throws in too much extra bits that we don't need. So I'm going to click the target button to jump to where main activity is. And next to it, I'm going to make a fragment. So right click on the package, new Kotlin class or file. And I'm going to call this our running fragment, ensuring it's on class, and enter. And then the first thing I'm going to do is extend the fragment class. So colon to extend in Kotlin classes, fragment brackets. Okay, I need to import that and ensuring it's the Android X.fragment, not the crossed out Android.app one. Okay, so Android X fragment, import, and that's all we need to do for the moment. Next, we'll go ahead and make a very simple layout file. So I'm going to open the resource folder, open the layout folder, and I'm going to right click and do new layout resource file. And I'm going to follow the Android conventions. So the name of the class in reverse. So what it is a fragment underscore and then running in snake case. I'll leave the root element as a constraint layout. We know how to use that now. Okay. And just to prove that this works, as we'll be running this on the emulator in a moment, I'll put a text view. So I'll do text view with wrap content. But to make it in the middle of the screen so it's nice and clear, I'll do those opposing constraints. So if I do top to the top of a parent and bottom to the bottom of the parent, that'll center it vertically. If I do start to the start of the parent and end to the end of the parent, that'll center it horizontally. So if I just add some text, I'll say, hooray, now I can add fragments into my apps, exclamation mark. I'll do a self-closing tag and an auto format, and if we look to the right, we can see we have a centered text view. Good. So moving back to the fragment, if this was an activity, we would override the onCreate method and then call setContentView. If I just show you a main activity, onCreate, we definitely do the call to the super.onCreate, and then we do setContentView somewhere. That's how we get the view on the screen. Well, as shown in the Introduction to Fragments tutorial before, the way we do it in Fragment is we override not onCreate, but onCreateView. So if you go ahead and type that and autocomplete, and that will bring in the onCreateView method. We've got 3 parameters, inflator, container, and saved instance state. Let's put them on different lines because it's quite a long list of parameters, so that's fine. And then we have a colon to say that this method returns a view, a nullable view. So we're going to go ahead and delete the initial return where we return the super onCreateView. So go ahead and delete that. And we now need to inflate the view ourselves and then return that view. So the way we inflate our layout file, a little bit like we've done in our recycler view before, we use this layout inflator. So we've already got access to the layout inflator. It's one of our method parameters. So if I type inflator above, autocomplete, and there's a method on that called .inflate. And then if I look at this hint, there's 3 things I need. I'm looking at the third one down, a resource, a layout resource, a root to add it to, and then there's also attached to root, a true or false value. And we'll get into that in a moment. So first things first, let's add our resource layout file. So r.layout.fragment running. So we tell it what layout file to look at, what layout file to read, and then create views from. So we're going to inflate that file. We have a container already in our parameters. You can see above, container, a view group. That will be the container from the activity. So that frame layout, that's the thing we're going to be adding it to. Okay. So we'll go ahead and do the same container we have available, container. This will be given to us when onCreateView runs. But it's very important that for this attached to root, that we actually set this to be false. And you might be wondering, why do we do that? Well, the notion of this fragment being attached to something, this happens in the activity, okay? We inflate it into this container, we put the fragments layout into the container, but actually the fragment becomes attached to the activity, not to this container, okay? If that sounds confusing, I totally understand, but there's a bit of behind the scenes stuff happening when in the activity we add this fragment to the container. But the fundamental thing is that the fragment is attached, hosted by the whole activity. It's not attached or hosted by this container. It's not attached to the frame layout, okay? So we must say false. I've had many a time where I've done true and the app's not worked and I've not been able to understand why. So all of this line, this inflator.inflate, where we pass in the layout file, the container to inflate it to, and saying not to attach it to this container, that will return a view variable. So if I do val view equals inflator.inflate, well, now I have my view, so I can simply do return view, and that will work. And actually, because I don't do anything with this local variable other than return it, Kotlin is suggesting why not just return it inline. So I'll go ahead and do that. Alt enter, option enter. I'll take the suggestion, inline variable, return, and then this line of code. And that is all we need to do inside our fragment to inflate that layout file and make it visible on the screen. So now we are ready to attach this fragment to our activity. So go ahead now to make an activity and we'll do the final bit of code. So I'm going to remove the binding.bottom nav. Now there's a slightly complicated looking bit of code to do with fragment transactions. So what we'll do in this tutorial is quickly do the code to see how simple it is, how straightforward it is. And then in a later tutorial, we'll dig in a little bit more to what a fragment transaction is, what's happening behind the scenes, and the different things we can do with a fragment transaction. But the code is quite simple. So first of all, we need to get reference to the fragment manager. Every activity has a variable, a thing. It's inside this. It's part of the AppCompat activity class, and it's a fragment manager. And it's actually called the support fragment manager. They updated it a few years ago, so support meaning it's backwards compatible for older versions of Android. So the support fragment manager, that's a variable we have access to. And now, because we've added that dependency to the fragment library, we have a lovely little shortcut that makes the code a little bit easier for our fragment transaction. All we need to do is do .commit. Okay, if you don't have access to this method, if nothing comes up, make sure you sync your project with Gradle files. Make sure you've synced up that dependency. You can click the blue elephant at the top right, okay? But if you've done that, you'll have access to this shortcut called commit. And you can see that we have a prompt saying it's a fragment transaction, and we'll talk a little bit more about what this means and what this does later on. But now we have this block, we can simply type add. And then we can add, as part of this transaction, as part of this thing, where we attach the fragment to this activity by adding it to the container, we can simply add a new running fragment here. So we only need two arguments here, the container ID and the fragment itself. So you might think, oh, well, we can do binding dot and then the frame content, but actually it needs the ID. We can't use the binding class. Okay, so this is one instance where for now we just do need to type in that ID manually. So we'll do r.id.frameContent. It needs to be a layout resource ID. So this fragment transaction will look and try and find that in our view. And then the next thing it needs is a new instance of the fragment. So we can simply do running fragment and make a new object like that. So a little bit different to activities. We never make a new instance of main activity. We would never do this. Okay, activities are done automatically by the system. But with fragments, we do need to create them ourselves. Okay, so here I'm just making a new instance of running fragment. So in a small piece of code here, we've gotten reference to the activities fragment manager, the thing that can handle fragments and all the things that happens with that. And we've told it to commit to do, basically, a transaction. We've told it to add to this container, our content frame, our frame layout, this new fragment. Simple as that. And when I run this on the emulator, we can see our fragment added to the layout. Fantastic. Okay, so for a quick recap, the four things we did here, we added a new dependency, some of the shortcuts, including that lovely little commit shortcut. You'll see in a later tutorial where I'll talk more about fragment transactions, how that's saved us a little bit of code. Okay, so we've added the dependency. We made a new fragment and extended fragment. We made the corresponding layout file. The way we get that to show in a fragment is with the onCreateView method. We override this and we do this inflator.inflate line, a bit like we've done before in our recycler views, just manually inflating a layout file from scratch, kind of what happens in set content view under the hood, but we just do it ourselves. And then in main activity, we do a fragment transaction, and we have this lovely little shorthand where we access the fragment manager, call .commit, and then inside this block we can do things, do transactions. And the transaction we want to do is add. And when we commit this, when we run this code, the activity knows what to do. It takes our new fragment, it adds it to that container, and then it attaches it to the activity. It is kind of bound to the activity attached. So that's the 4 steps to adding fragments into our activity. Fantastic. We now know how to add fragments to a container, to a view group like our frame layout. So the next thing to move on to is switching between fragments, changing what's on the screen when the user changes the destination. Now, the way we respond to a user clicking on the bottom navigation bar, there's a bit of extra work there, or certainly it's a new concept than just our standard button click listener. And the focus of this tutorial is to learn how to switch fragments, how to swap them out, not so much the bottom navigation view and how we respond to clicks on that. So what we'll do very quickly in this tutorial is we'll just stick a couple of basic buttons in the layout towards the bottom of the screen near our bottom navigation view, just so we can show the concept of how we switch between fragments. So I'm going to move over to our main activity layout, so Shift, and then activity_main. And what I'm going to do, underneath the frame layout where we put our fragment, I'm going to put a couple of buttons, just basic buttons. So button, I'll do wrap content, and I'll just call this one running. Give it an ID of button_running. I'm going to go ahead and copy this whole thing, paste a second button, which I'll call button cycling. And call it cycling if you can go ahead and do the same. And then I'll move it towards the bottom of the screen. So what I'll do is I'll put it just above the bottom navigation view. So I'll say the bottom of the button to the top of the, and then I'll do the bottom nav. You can see that jumps down on the right. And I'll make this one on the left of the screen. So start to the start of parent, and that'll be fine. And then I'll do similar on the cycling button. I'll say bottom to the top of the bottom nav. That also jumps down. But this one I'll say end to the end of. I'll just stick it on the other side. Give them both a tiny bit of margin, 12 dp layout margin. I'll copy that. Okay. So just a quick little hack to give us 2 buttons that we'll use to swap the fragments. Very soon we're going to be learning how to use the bottom navigation view and how we listen for clicks on that. Okay. But for now that will do. So I'm going to close down the activity main layout. And I'm going to quickly create a couple of button click listeners for those 2 new buttons. So underneath our fragment transaction, a few line breaks, I'll do binding button cycling.setOnClickListener. And I'll type a function that doesn't exist yet. I'll say on cycling clicked with brackets, and then I'll use the error, Alt-Enter, create function. So I'm going to use that error to make the function. Okay. And I'm going to duplicate that line. So I'm going to click on line 23 for me, button cycling, Command D, Control D, and change button cycling to button. button running, and I'll change this to another method. So on running clicked, like that. And again, I'm going to use the error to make the function for me. Okay, so I've got a couple of buttons, I've got the click listener on them, and then I can do something in these two blocks here. Just to show that we are indeed switching between two distinct, different fragments, let's also create a cycling fragment. So we have our running fragment that says, hooray, now I can add fragments into my app. Actually, I'll just change this for, this is the running fragment, so we know that one's running. Okay, and I'm very quickly going to create a cycling fragment and layout. So in the package, right-click, new class, cycling fragment. If you can go ahead and do the same, create a cycling fragment and layout. So in the package, right-click, new class, cycling fragment. If you can go ahead and do the same, it wants to extend fragment with the brackets. I will create a new layout, so right click. Actually, what I'll do is I'll click on fragment running, okay, and I'll do Control C or Command C, and then I'll click on the layout folder and do Control V, Command V to paste that. So I'm actually copying and pasting the whole file. And when you do this, it does give you the opportunity to rename the file. So I'll call this one fragment_cycling and click refactor. And you can see we have a new layout file called fragment cycling. Okay, it's got the same text content as the previous running fragment, but I can simply change that for cycling. But that saved us quite a bit of time there. So if you ever have a very, very similar layout file or something like that, you can copy and paste the file, give it a different name, and then just make the changes that you need. So we have, this is the cycling fragment, and this is the running fragment. So when we switch between these two fragments in a moment, we're going to be able to see the difference, see that we've moved to a different fragment. Good. So I do need to inflate the view in the cycling fragment class. So if you can move over to cycling fragment, the class, and then in the class body, we'll override on create view. We want this to soon become a habit. And I'm going to leave the word return, but I'm going to delete the super.onCreateView view thing. So I'm going to type inflator from the parameters above, inflator.inflate, and it's the name of the resource file, so r.layout.fragmentCycling. It's the root of the view group, so I'll use that container above, and attach to root always false, otherwise you're going to run into problems. So that's all we need to do. So now we can go back to main activity and look at how we might go about swapping these fragments out. So looking at main activity, if I just scroll up a little bit, we can see in our onCreate method that shortly after setting the content view, we perform a fragment transaction. This .commit block, which is a useful little shortcut when we added that dependency, that fragment KTX dependency. This fragment transaction is what adds the default running fragment to our screen. So on a basic level, you might think we can just copy this whole block, support fragment manager.commit, we can copy that and paste it in on running clicked and on cycling clicked. And in a way, we can, but we're going to run into one small problem when we do this, which is good because it will teach us something about fragment transactions and what sort of transactions we have available. But for now, let's copy the whole support fragment manager.commit block, so .commit in the braces, copy, let's paste that on running clicked and on cycling clicked. So of course, for the on running clicked button, we can leave it as the running fragment, but in the on cycling clicked, we want to change it for the cycling fragment, and then brackets to make a new instance, to make a new object, okay? So this will kind of work. We have a fragment transaction, and we are adding to the frame content an instance of the running fragment or cycling fragment. And the ability to add, this add method you can see here, okay? This is something available to us in our fragment transaction. But let's see what happens when we do this. So let's run the app now. Okay, and you can see by default we have, this is the running fragment. If I just scroll up in the code, this happens in onCreate. We add the initial running fragment. But let's see what happens when I click on cycling. Okay, do you see that? It's kind of hard to see what's going on there, but it appears to have put the cycling fragment on top of the running fragment. Okay? And the reason for this is we have used the command add. We are adding this fragment. So under the hood, this fragment transaction thing, and there's quite a bit of complicated code that Android does for us that we don't have to worry about. But what it's doing is it's taking the ID of our container, the frame content, which happens to be a frame layout, although I'm going to show you in a minute how it can be any view group, okay? But ours is a frame layout, and we're adding to that view group. We're creating the fragment. In the fragment, we inflate the view in the onCreateView method, and once we've got that inflated view, we're adding it to the frame layout. Well, because we're simply just adding it, it's not doing anything about the previous fragment, and it's simply placing our fragment on top. And if I keep clicking the buttons, you can see the text getting darker and darker as multiple versions of that text get added over and over again. So this isn't what we want. So if we head over now to the Android documentation on this fragment transaction thing, we can see a few of the commands we have available to us. We don't just have the ability to add a fragment, we can do other things, and we're going to see in just a moment there's a much more appropriate transaction command we can call. So, documentation. I'm currently in the Create a Fragment setup guide, but if I just look on the left where this Create a Fragment is, you can see in our fragment section, I can see there's a section on fragment transactions. So when I click this, we get quite a lengthy introduction to what fragment transactions are. We don't need to understand every single word of this, but there's a few key points to take away. So at runtime, or when the app is running, a fragment manager, well, we've already seen this, it can add, remove, replace, and perform other actions with fragments in response to a user interaction. Okay, so we don't just have to add fragments, but we can also do other things with them. And looking at this straight away, the command that we're going to probably want is replace. Okay? You can go ahead and read as much of this introduction to fragment transactions as you want, but all you really need to know is, once you create a fragment transaction, and we do that with that .commit block, that nice little shortcut, well, at that point, we can do multiple things. And if I scroll down, I can see a heading called adding and removing fragments. So to add a fragment to a fragment manager, we call add on the transaction. Well, we've already done this, and it tells us that this method receives the ID of the container, as well as the class of the fragment we wish to add. Okay? Don't need to worry about too many of the technical details of the other things. Really, it's absolutely fine to just trust that it works under the hood. The code is quite complicated, you don't need to know everything about this. But as we scroll down, we can see use replace to replace an existing fragment in a container with an instance of a new fragment class that you provide. Okay, so we've been doing add, we're going to change it for replace. Please don't copy the example code that they provided. They provided it in a slightly different format to what we've done, and this may not always work depending on what Android Studio version you have. So ignore their code for now. The code we've got is good, but we just need to change the command for replace, and hopefully things should work well. So heading back over now to Android Studio, I'm going to change both of the button click listeners for replace. So simply typing replace instead of add. Okay, I'm going to copy that and paste that. If I now run the app, this should now work as we expect, swapping out that fragment each time. Okay, so we have our default running fragment in the onCreate block, and when I click cycling, it simply swaps over, and then running, cycling, running, it replaces it each time, which is absolutely fantastic. And actually, you might be thinking, well, do we need to use add for the very first fragment and then replace for all subsequent ones? Actually, you can just do replace for all of them. And if there's nothing in the container already, if there's no fragment added initially, it's not a problem. It will go ahead and add it. But if there is something, then it will replace it. So in my personal projects, I tend to use replace all the time. There's not many use cases where I need to add things on top of each other. Okay, so that's my number one tip, really. If you're playing with the fragment transactions and you want to swap out fragments, just use replace for everything. If I go ahead and run this, I'll show you how that's absolutely fine. There's no problems. We can see on app load, our running fragment is added absolutely fine. Okay. Of course, if I remove this block in the onCreate method, if I remove this, and I run the app, well, initially we don't have anything until we start clicking, okay? So you might be thinking, okay, so do I always have to add in code programmatically a block for my first fragment? And the answer is actually no. If we head back over to our documentation just for the last time in this tutorial, you may or may not have seen this line here to do with adding and removing fragments. It is strongly recommended that the container is a fragment container view, okay, and not a frame layout. So if I just go back to our layout code now, so back to Android Studio, and I'm going to shift into activity_main. So we've used a frame layout, which is of course a view group. If I control click on frame layout or command click, frame layout extends view group. Okay, it's a container for other views. I'm just going to close this down. So we can actually add any view group. You can even add linear layouts. I could change this frame layout for a linear layout. I'll just set the orientation to vertical. And if I run this, you can see it still works exactly as expected. So you can pretty much use any view group for our container. But the documentation says to use fragment container view. And actually, this fragment container view is only available to us because we added that dependency a couple of tutorials ago. It doesn't come by default in new projects. But because we added that dependency, we have access to this fragment container view. So let's go ahead now and change our container for this. So I'm going to double click linear layout and start typing with a capital F, fragment, capital C, container, capital V, view, and autocomplete. Okay, so we're now using the recommended container, the recommended view group. And when I control click or command click on the fragment container view, we can see it actually extends a frame layout, which in turn, when I command click, as we know, extends a view group. So a fragment container view extends frame layout, which extends a view group. So a fragment container view is, by extension, a view group, but it is the recommended one to use. There's a few extra things it does under the hood to make the swapping and the remembering of the fragments much, much more secure. Okay, so I'm going to close this fragment container view code. But one major benefit to us using the fragment container view, as opposed to a simple frame layout, is one extra attribute called name. If you start typing name and autocomplete, this Android : name, we can now give the name of the fragment that we want to initialize this container with. And this is a wonderful little shortcut. Pretty much most of the time, we're going to want to have an initial fragment showing in a container. So rather than having that commit transaction somewhere on onCreate, we can actually just put the name of the class here, and this fragment container view will know what to do with that, and it will take care of initializing our first default fragment. The only tricky thing is, the way we do this is by typing the full package name of our fragment. So if I look on the left, I can see my package is com.vinnorman.recordkeeper, and then .running fragment. So you're going to need to type your package name exactly as it is. Okay, so for me, it is com.vinnorman.recordkeeper. com.vinnorman. Autocomplete won't work here, unfortunately, not at the moment anyway. Maybe in a later version I'll change this. But com.vinnorman.recordkeeper, one more dot, and then the name of the fragment as it shows in the project pane. So for me that is running fragment. So now we have a fragment container view. This is the recommended view group from the documentation. It gives us access to this name attribute that wouldn't work in a frame layout or a linear layout. It only works in this fragment container view. So when I go back to main activity, I can actually delete the initial fragment transaction. I can remove that completely. So I've completely removed the initial transaction. I've just got the transactions for when we click on the buttons. So if I run this now for one final time, and we can see we have our initial running fragment thanks to that name attribute. And when I click the buttons, the fragment swaps out. So we have one activity, one main activity, and inside this we have the ability to swap between fragments, swap between portions of our screen, which is absolutely fantastic. We're pretty much exactly where we need to be to start making this work with our bottom navigation view. Okay, so the key takeaway is, for the most part, you want to be using replace. There's not many examples where using add is particularly useful to us. So go ahead and use replace for your fragment transaction to swap out any existing fragment. And rather than writing this transaction for our initial fragment, if you use a fragment container view, then you can add the name attribute. You'll need to give the full package name of your fragment class, so the package plus the name of the fragment. But then when you do that, the fragment container view will take care of initializing our fragment. So we've now got fragments working perfectly inside our app. And we're now ready to move on to plugging this in to our bottom navigation view.